In AD 1494, two crowns and a pope attempted something so audacious that it still governs the modern imagination of power. They tried to divide the unknown world before they truly understood it. The paradox is immense. Ignorance did not restrain ambition. Ignorance accelerated it. What emerged at Tordesillas was not merely a treaty, but a prototype for a global habit of rule. To call the Treaty of Tordesillas a medieval afterthought is to misunderstand the architecture of the modern age. This was not a dying echo of crusading Europe, nor a quaint diplomatic footnote to the voyages of Columbus. It was a hinge. On one side stood an older world of dynastic privilege, papal arbitration, and sacral monarchy. On the other stood an emerging order in which states fused law, intelligence, commerce, and violence into a system that could project power across oceans. Tordesillas belongs to that threshold. It marks the moment when Europe ceased merely to explore the world and began, with startling confidence, to assign it. The wider chessboard had been forming for generations. Late 15th century Europe was not peaceful, nor was it intellectually settled. It was a continent forged by crusading memory, aristocratic warfare, and commercial appetite. Wealth from the east had long moved through complex overland and maritime routes, enriching intermediaries and frustrating rulers who desired direct access. The fall of Constantinople in AD 1453 did not create this hunger, but it intensified the strategic urgency surrounding it. The old pathways now seemed more vulnerable, more contested, and more expensive. Therefore, the search for alternatives became not a romantic enterprise, but a geopolitical necessity. Portugal grasped this earlier than most. Its rise was not the product of a single bold voyage, but of patient statecraft. For decades, Portuguese rulers had invested in Atlantic navigation, African reconnaissance, and the construction of fortified maritime nodes. This expansion was not reckless improvisation. It was bureaucratized ambition. Pilots gathered winds and currents as though they were military secrets. Crown officials tracked trading opportunities with the discipline of accountants and spies. Fortresses along the African coast did not merely defend ships. They converted movement into system, and system into advantage. The Portuguese monarchy was learning a lesson that later empires would perfect. Knowledge that can be organized becomes power that can be scaled. This is what made Columbus such a strategic disruption. Castile and Aragon had only just emerged from the conquest of Granada in AD 1492, a victory that completed a centuries-long struggle and gave the Catholic monarchs new prestige, confidence, and ideological momentum. Their monarchy was fresh from triumph, eager for glory, and newly prepared to convert military success into broader statecraft. Then Columbus returned with claims of western lands and access to Asia. Whether those claims were geographically accurate mattered less at first than the political opening they created. Suddenly, Castile possessed an argument for a route to wealth and empire that bypassed Portuguese accumulation. A western horizon had entered Iberian rivalry. But this was not a rivalry unfolding on blank parchment. Earlier agreements already existed. The Treaty of Alcacovas in AD 1479 had settled prior disputes between Castile and Portugal, and in doing so it favored Portugal's Atlantic position. Castile retained the Canary Islands, but Portugal secured recognition for its rights elsewhere in the Atlantic sphere. This older settlement mattered because Columbus threatened to disturb not merely prestige, but a legal and strategic balance that Lisbon believed had already been recognized. Therefore, the issue after AD 1492 was never simply discovery. It was jurisdiction. It was entitlement. It was whether a breakthrough voyage could override an established architecture of claims. The papacy entered this conflict not as a decorative relic, but as a functioning legitimizing machine. In late 15th century Europe, the moral and political prestige of Rome still carried immense force. Papal approval could transform appetite into title. It could convert ambition into law-like recognition among Christian powers. This was crucial in a world where crowns competed fiercely but still sought to frame their actions within a larger sacred order. The Pope could not command oceans into obedience, but he could endow expansion with a language of righteousness. The authority of Rome gave conquest a grammar. Here the central paradox sharpens. The less Europeans knew about the true size and shape of the planet, the more aggressively they sought to partition it. This was not irrational in the narrow strategic sense. Uncertainty raised the stakes. If unknown regions might contain spices, metals, labor, strategic ports, or future kingdoms, then delay became dangerous. Better, from the perspective of rival courts, to establish claims early and clarify reality later. Such logic has echoed across centuries. States rarely wait for perfect knowledge when the prize might be enormous. They seize legal initiative first, then force geography to submit afterward. The immediate stakes were immense. An Iberian war between two Catholic powers would have been costly and destabilizing at the exact moment both crowns were poised for overseas expansion. Such a conflict would have squandered manpower, treasure, and dynastic credibility. But beyond the danger of war lay a larger question. Would discovery become an open competition in which every Christian power rushed into the Atlantic and beyond? Or would it be treated as pre-allocated entitlement, governed by legal doctrine, ecclesiastical blessing, and negotiated spheres? The answer mattered not merely for Iberia, but for the political imagination of empire itself. At the center of the Portuguese response stood one of the era's most formidable strategists, King John II. Too often remembered in simplified terms as merely a hard ruler or a capable monarch, he was in fact something more consequential. He understood that the future belonged to states that could marry dynastic purpose to information control. He respected maritime logistics. He grasped the value of charts, routes, timing, and secrecy. Portugal's power did not rest simply on ships crossing water. It rested on an accumulated apparatus of pilots, cosmographers, informants, financiers, and administrators who transformed voyages into state knowledge. The map room, under such conditions, became as strategically important as the battlefield. Ferdinand and Isabella faced a different problem. Their monarchy possessed immense ambition and formidable political skill, but it lacked Portugal's depth of oceanic infrastructure. Columbus had opened a possibility, but possibility without rapid legitimation could evaporate. Time therefore favored Lisbon unless Castile moved swiftly to secure formal recognition of its western gains. The Catholic monarchs needed legal speed. They needed the new discoveries framed not as uncertain ventures vulnerable to Portuguese challenge, but as sanctioned possessions under a higher authority. Hence the turn to the papacy was not a matter of vanity. It was a race against strategic erosion. Pope Alexander VI became the pivotal arbiter. His reputation has long been shadowed by the politics of his pontificate, and rightly so. He was not a detached shepherd above the quarrels of kings. He was a political pope operating within the realities of alliance, influence, and dynastic calculation. In AD 1493, papal bulls including Inter Quitera drew a line favorable to Castile, granting broad recognition to Western discoveries under the Spanish crown. On paper, this looked decisive. Rome had spoken. Castile had gained the symbolic high ground. But a weaker state might have accepted the humiliation and attempted to salvage scraps from the judgment. Portugal did not. That refusal is one of the most important strategic moves in the entire story. Lisbon negotiated from strength because it possessed assets more durable than papal sentiment. Portugal had experience, routes, and maritime confidence. It also had a ruling court that understood a brutal truth about legality: authority matters most when backed by capability. John II did not deny the prestige of papal intervention, but he refused to treat it as final. A line written in Rome could not simply erase Portuguese interests built through decades of navigation and diplomacy. Therefore, the dispute shifted from unilateral papal grant to bilateral bargaining between crowns that recognized each other's ability to resist. What emerged from those negotiations was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed on June 7 AD 1494. It moved the demarcation line to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. At first glance this appears technical, almost sterile, like a matter for specialists in arcane measurement. But in strategic terms it was explosive. That adjustment gave Portugal breathing room in the Atlantic and created the legal latitude for future claims that the earlier papal arrangement might have constrained. A seemingly abstract modification in distance altered the political future of continents. The minds behind this settlement understood a fact often neglected in popular storytelling: geography in this age was not merely discovered, it was negotiated through institutions. Cartographers, pilots, and cosmographers were not background technicians. They were intelligence assets. Their estimates, their charts, and their guarded knowledge could strengthen a crown's diplomatic position as effectively as soldiers could strengthen a frontier. To possess superior understanding of currents, coastlines, and distances was to possess leverage. Therefore, secrecy became policy. Maritime knowledge was state property. The ocean was vast, but information about it was concentrated and jealously defended. Yet beneath the appearance of technical precision lay a profound instability. Neither side could accurately determine longitude in the open ocean. This limitation mattered enormously. A line on parchment could be described in legal language, but it could not be reliably marked or verified at sea with consistent precision. The treaty, then, rested on what might be called enforceable ambiguity. It was less a clean border than a diplomatic instrument designed to reduce conflict while preserving room for interpretation. This was not a flaw accidentally tolerated. It was part of the settlement's utility. When precision is impossible, ambiguity can become a weapon of order. That insight reveals why Tordesillas was at once absurd in method and formidable in consequence. Its method was absurd because two crowns presumed to divide vast unknown regions, including lands already inhabited by peoples entirely absent from the negotiations. Its confidence exceeded its knowledge by a staggering margin. But its consequence was formidable because the treaty worked in the one immediate way that mattered most. It reduced the likelihood of direct war between Portugal and Castile and allowed both monarchies to project energy outward instead of consuming themselves inward. A fiction became functional because powerful states agreed to behave as though it were real. This is a recurring principle in the history of power. Institutions do not always begin by reflecting reality. Often they begin by proposing a version of reality that enough force can later sustain. Tordesillas belonged to that category. The line did not emerge from accurate global understanding. It emerged from a desire to stabilize rivalry under conditions of ignorance. But once courts, clerics, merchants, and navigators organized themselves around that line, it acquired political mass. It began to shape decisions, voyages, and imperial expectations. History is filled with abstractions that became destiny because states armed them. The immediate proof appeared in Brazil. In AD 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral reached the Brazilian coast. Whether his landfall resulted from deliberate navigation, controlled westward swing, or the complex realities of Atlantic sailing remains debated. But in legal and imperial terms, the key point is simpler. Portugal could plausibly place that coast within its side of the Tordesillas line. Therefore, an agreement that had looked speculative suddenly yielded tangible strategic reward. Brazil did not merely become a possession by accident of contact. It became one of the treaty's most enduring validations from the Portuguese perspective. The consequences did not stop in the Atlantic. Tordesillas projected its contradictions across the globe. Once voyages pushed around Africa into Asia, and once Spaniards crossed the Pacific, ambitions opened wider, the unresolved anti-meridian became unavoidable. If one line divided the globe in the west, where did its opposite division lie in the east? The problem was not academic. It bore directly on the Moluccas, the coveted spice islands whose value was so great that measurement became inseparable from strategy. Therefore, the original treaty generated disputes that outlived its first context, contributing eventually to the Treaty of Zaragoza in AD 1529. The world had become too interconnected for a single line to remain simple. What had occurred, then, was a conceptual conquest before the full physical conquest. Europe had learned that paper claims, backed by institutions and fleets, could reorganize the political meaning of oceans. This was the deeper pivot. The true climax of Tordesillas was not cannon fire or dramatic battle. It was the administrative realization that vast spaces could be rendered governable in advance through legal doctrine, diplomatic agreement, and spiritual sanction. Such an achievement was not morally neutral. It made later violence easier by making it appear procedurally settled. Once domination is framed as jurisdiction, resistance can be reclassified as disorder. In strategic terms, both crowns displayed masterstrokes and blindness. Portugal's masterstroke was unmistakable. It took an initially unfavorable papal settlement and transformed it through hard negotiation into a more advantageous bilateral treaty. This was a triumph of disciplined statecraft over symbolic disadvantage. Castile's masterstroke was different but no less significant. It secured immediate legitimacy for westward expansion at a moment when delay could have allowed Portuguese experience to overwhelm Spanish momentum. But both sides also committed foundational blunders. They assumed their private division could function as universal order. More gravely still, they erased indigenous sovereignty at the level of law. Entire civilizations were not merely conquered in war, they were omitted in principle. This omission was not incidental. It was the administrative seat of empire. The peoples already living in the Americas, in Africa's coastal networks, and across Asia's political systems did not disappear because Europeans ignored them. But legal frameworks that denied their standing made future expropriation easier to rationalize. The treaty did not itself create every conquest that followed. Yet it helped normalize a mindset in which distant societies could be classified as available objects of Christian monarchical claim. Before empires seize land physically, they often erase the rightful owners conceptually. From Tordesillas flowed the broad pattern of Iberian overseas empires. Portugal deepened its expansion through Africa and into Asia while consolidating Brazil as a major imperial domain. Castile developed its American empire through Caribbean footholds and continental conquests that would become staggering in scale. The treaty did not determine every route and every outcome, but it provided an organizing framework for early imperial expectation. Each crown now possessed a recognized sphere in which investment, military planning, missionary effort, and commercial extraction could proceed with less fear of immediate Iberian collision. Therefore, Tordesillas functioned as an imperial traffic law for an age of expansion. It also normalized a dangerous doctrine, that Christian monarchies could claim sovereignty over distant lands through a blend of papal approval, discovery rhetoric, and military enforcement. This fusion mattered deeply. Discovery alone might seem exploratory. Papal sanction alone might seem spiritual. Force alone might seem crude. But together they formed a potent ideological machine. A voyage-identified opportunity. The Church endowed it with moral language. The state enforced it with ships and arms. Conquest thus acquired not merely momentum, but apparent legitimacy. Missionary empire emerged within this same structure. Conversion and conquest were not morally separate tracks that merely happened to coincide. In practice they became mutually reinforcing. The language of salvation could soften imperial violence in the minds of its authors, while imperial authority could widen the reach of missionary institutions. This did not mean faith was always insincere. It means faith functioned politically. It provided empire with a sacred vocabulary in which domination could be narrated as order, uplift, and divine purpose. Belief became a grammar through which expansion could present itself as virtue. At the same time, Tordesillas belongs to the prehistory of international law. That statement must be handled carefully. The treaty was not modern law in the contemporary sense, nor was it universally accepted. But it was an early attempt to organize global rivalry through recognized procedures, textual agreements, and ostensibly lawful claims. It exposed, however, the hypocrisy present near the birth of such order. Universal principles were proclaimed selectively by the powerful. The world was divided in the language of law, yet those most affected were not parties to the arrangement. Here lies a permanent tension in international politics. Order for some is often domination for others. The economic consequences were vast and grim. Extractive imperial systems expanded across the Atlantic and beyond. New colonial arrangements fed plantation economies, coerced labor regimes, and ultimately the terrible growth of Atlantic slavery. Tordesillas did not single-handedly create these systems, but it helped establish the legal and strategic confidence under which they could flourish. Once crowns believed they possessed rightful spheres of exploitation, merchants, settlers, and officials could operate inside a framework that rewarded extraction while muting moral doubt. The line across the ocean became, in time, a line through human bodies. Yet the treaty also revealed the limits of unilateral legitimacy. Papal blessing and Iberian agreement could structure an early order, but only so long as sufficient power sustained it. Other European states would eventually reject the monopoly entirely. England, France, and the Dutch did not accept that a pope and 2 Iberian crowns had settled the fate of global commerce. Their resistance exposed a brutal truth. Legal order survives only as long as the balance of power allows it to survive. Once rival states acquired enough maritime capacity, they denied the premise itself. Monopoly dressed as law remained monopoly. That later collapse does not diminish Tordesillas. It clarifies it. The treaty was never a permanent solution to world division. It was a first successful demonstration that states could claim distant spaces through coordinated language, law, and force before possessing full control of them. In this sense, Tordesillas was less a conclusion than a prototype. It foreshadowed later zones of influence, colonial mandates, protectorates, partition agreements, and strategic corridors. Great powers would repeatedly redraw maps in advance of reality, then send administrators and armies to make those designs tangible. States first conquer the world in language, then in law, then on the ground. Maps, in this story, must be understood correctly. They were not passive mirrors of reality. They were proposals, ambitions, and threats. A map could imply ownership where none yet existed. It could elevate a tentative route into a strategic claim. It could flatten unknown societies into empty spaces awaiting inscription. Therefore, the cartographic imagination of empire was never innocent. Every line on the page invited a future arrangement of ports, taxes, missions, plantations, and garrisons. To draw was already to govern in anticipation. Human beings are repeatedly seduced by administrative clarity. A border appears neat on parchment and therefore respectable. A decree appears orderly and therefore just. But history warns otherwise. Clarity in documents can conceal catastrophe in life. Tordesillas is one of the starkest examples. The line was tidy in diplomatic concept, yet the worlds it touched were complex, populated, sovereign, and irreducible. The treaty's elegance as an agreement among powers masked its violence as an agreement over others. This is one of civilization's most dangerous habits, mistaking formal order for moral legitimacy. The fog of war and human flaw were present throughout. John II did not know the world's full dimensions. Ferdinand and Isabella did not know what Columbus had truly found. The Pope could not arbitrate with complete knowledge of the spaces under dispute. Their decisions were massive gambles made under radical uncertainty. But uncertainty did not produce humility. It produced assertion. Why? Because rulers confronting limited information often choose confidence over hesitation when prestige, wealth, and security seem at stake. To hesitate is to risk losing initiative. To assert is to risk error on a colossal scale. Tordesillas was born from that exact calculus. This is why the treaty still feels modern. Contemporary geopolitics remains haunted by the same pattern. Great powers continue to draft spheres, corridors, mandates, and security architectures before realities on the ground are settled. They classify seas, resources, airspace, and strategic regions through legal language and policy frameworks that often outrun moral consensus. They rely on technical terminology to dignify contests of power. They invoke order while advancing advantage. The vocabulary changes. The habit endures. The verdict is severe. Tordesillas succeeded strategically in the short term because it helped prevent immediate Iberian War and allowed two aggressive monarchies to expand outward with reduced mutual friction. It gave Portugal room for Brazil and continuity for its eastern ambitions. It gave Castile legitimacy for a westward empire of staggering consequence. In that narrow sense, it was an effective instrument of statecraft. But its deeper cost was civilizational. It normalized the partition of worlds without the consent of those who lived in them. It fused faith, law, and force into an imperial machine. It made abstraction a prelude to domination. Its brilliance as diplomacy cannot be separated from its devastation as precedent. The modern mirror is impossible to ignore. Tordesillas reveals that power often begins by naming, classifying, and defining before it occupies. A claim is drafted. A principle is announced. A line is proposed. Then institutions gather around it until the proposal hardens into fact. Modern states and empires have repeated this rhythm in colonial partition, strategic doctrine, economic zoning, and even digital governance. The old oceanic line survives as a method. The world is still divided first in the imagination of authority, then in policy, then in lived consequence. And so the final legacy of Tordesillas is not merely that a pope and two crowns tried to split the world. It is that they succeeded enough to prove a terrifying principle. Once power persuades itself that an abstraction is lawful, it can mobilize priests, merchants, fleets, and armies to make the abstraction real. The line that claimed the ocean was never just a line. It was a declaration about who counted as human in law, who counted as sovereign in history, and who could be transformed into silence by paperwork. The legacy question lingers beyond the treaty itself. If civilization so often mistakes authorized language for justice, then what modern borders, mandates, markets, or strategic doctrines are still being treated as legitimate merely because powerful institutions learn to speak them fluently? That question has no final archive, because it is not only about AD 1494. It is about the recurring human temptation to call domination order, and then to believe the map more than the world. If this episode sharpened the way power operates across time, subscribe for more historical investigations that expose the machinery beneath empires, doctrines, and world-changing decisions. And before leaving, answer this directly in the comments: what matters more in history, discovery itself, or the institutions that turn discovery into rule? For the next chapter, continue with the video now on the end screen.